Everybody, back in April, an excellent piece in the New York Review of Books entitled "Don't Join the Autocrats." Michael McFaul, who was the former US ambassador to Russia, suggests that he was just sending the manuscript for his book. The book is just out. It's called Autocrats versus Democrats. But he wrote in April, he said, and yet by the time the book comes out in October, I'm not sure which side the US will be on, at least in terms of China and Russia. So it's October now, Mike. What side is America on?
Well, that's a complicated answer. First, thanks for having me on. I think generally America and Americans are still on the side of democracy, both here at home and abroad. But President Trump doesn't think of the world in terms of autocrats and versus Democrats. I think he thinks more about strong leaders versus weak leaders. And at times, he kind of comes and goes with various leaders around the world. But most certainly with Mr. Putin, he kind of goes hot and kind of cold. He's in a cold phase now. But he's not afraid to engage with autocrats because he doesn't worry about these things in the way I do. And secondly, since I wrote that piece that you just showed, we most certainly have had some new challenges in terms of democratic practices here at home. So we're still in the fight, both at home and abroad.
Well, I hope you've sent your new book, Autocrats versus Democrats, to Donald Trump. He may, I don't know if he'll enjoy reading it, but maybe he would be educated by this. The key phrase in the subtitle, Mike, of your new book, Russia, China, America, and the New Global Disorder, reminds me of an excellent podcast by my friend Jason Pack, Disorder. He's been on the show many times. What is, in your view, the new global disorder? What does that word mean?
Well, for me, it means we've had a lot of disorder over 1,000 years of history, 2,000 years of history. When I teach a course on American foreign policy here at Stanford, I start with a video of 1,000 years of European history in 6 minutes. And wow. What I want my students to see is how many times the borders change and states rise and fall and weak states get swallowed up. Mongol hordes, Napoleon, Hitler, the Soviets, and then it gets to 45 and it kind of freezes. And, there were wars, and most certainly after the Soviet Union collapsed, there were wars in the Balkans and later with Putin's Russia. But after 45, we did agree to a new system. And we had a couple of rules about it. One was, thou shalt not annex the territory of thy neighbor. The other was a strong commitment to decolonization. And in that period, we had a more orderly world. It wasn't entirely global, by the way. It was mostly the free world versus the communist world, but there was some structure to it. Then the Soviet Union collapses, and in that period, in the post-Cold War order, we brought the Chinese into the World Trade Organization. We eventually tried to bring the Russians in to this liberal international world. That failed. But now I feel like that old order set up in 45 is beginning to crumble, first and foremost because the United States is not interested in anchoring it anymore. And I think that's dangerous. I don't think that'll lead to a world where the Chinese take over the world. I don't think they have the capacity to do that, nor the intention. Instead, I think it'll be more anarchic, like that map that I show my students where, whoever's most powerful will do what they can. And I don't think that's in the long-term interests of my country. So a big reason why I wrote the book is to end with some prescriptions to say, we don't have to just go back to that Hobbesian dog-eat-dog world. There is a structure, but if we want to play in that world, we have to invest some resources and time and attention to reforming it. We can't go back to what we had before, but at least reforming it to something that is more orderly.
Mike, I wonder whether there's a kind of an implicit criticism in the narrative that you just presented of the post-Second World War age. You suggested that you've got this 6-minute video history of 1,000 years of European history, and nothing changes after the Second World War. Are you suggesting that the system that came into place after the Second World War was unnatural in its stability? Because there's a great deal of nostalgia on particularly amongst progressives, but amongst internationalists as well, of the post-Second World War age. But are you suggesting that perhaps it was a little too stable, a little too ordered?
You know, Andrew, that's a great question, and I don't have an easy answer for it. I don't know. And I think we'll have to wait a couple hundred years to know whether that was a period of aberration and we're back to the way things always are, or whether we're in a little bit of an interregnum now and we're going to get back to some more orderly things. But I'd say a couple of things. First of all, as I write about in the book, it was stable in terms of not great power war, but there was a tremendous amount of killing and millions of people died during the Cold War. It wasn't cold. Vietnamese died, Angolans died, Hungarians died, Czechs died, Afghans died. We should remember that part. And so
Koreans as well, of course.
Koreans as well, yes. So, we use the word Cold War, but it actually, a lot of people did die. But we avoided great power war. One, because we had this system. Two, there was a great theory, and you remember Ken Waltz probably.
Of course, the first course I ever did at Berkeley was with Waltz, the father of realist international relations.
And he was a genius at what he did, and he was about explaining stability, right? And he talked about bipolarity being more stable than multipolarity. But he and others also talked about nuclear weapons, and that maybe those were a new system that, because the war would be so catastrophic, it would help to keep the peace. What I don't know, and those were true, and now that that's eroding, maybe we fade away. What I don't know is it just about power? And therefore, as America recedes and is not the hegemon that we used to be, will we go back to a more Hobbesian, anarchic world? Or is there a way to escape that? And liberals, small L liberals, would say, and I consider myself one of them, that we don't have to go back to that we can achieve cooperation and win-win outcomes through the creation of institutions and through the creation and nurturing of more open democratic societies. But I don't know. There's another author that I've learned a lot from. His name is Bob Kagan. And Bob wrote a book.
Who's been on this show a couple of times.
Oh, he has?
Show, yes.
Great. I'm glad to hear that. I feel like I'm in good company then. So, Bob wrote a book called The Jungle Grows Back a while back. And, his argument is we had all this stability because of American power. And now as we retreat, the jungle's going to grow back. I most certainly hope Bob is wrong, but I fear he may be right.
Your book comes with a lovely blurb from Frank Fukuyama, another old friend of the show. He describes your new book, Autocrats versus Democrats, as a monumental account of contemporary geopolitics. I hope Mikey's more right on this than he was about the end of history. What do you make of Fukuyama's thesis and the way it caught on in 89? Where were you in 89? And did you believe that we were at the end of history?
Well, in 89, I was trying to finish my DPhil at Oxford. I was bouncing between California and the Soviet Union. And then in the fall of 1990, I went to Moscow for a year, Fulbright scholar. So I was there at a very euphoric period in world history, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Friends of mine were part of the small d democratic movement. It was called Democratic Russia, that helped to bring down the Soviet Union. And I thought Fukuyama was right. I want to tell you honestly, it felt that way. It felt like everybody wanted to be part of the liberal international order. And remember, this is when George H.W. Bush mobilized the entire world, almost all of the world, to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, because we said we're not going to have annexation. We're going to work together. And there that was also a movement from communist economies to capitalist economies all over the world, including China, and it was real and happening, and that was the mood. I think in retrospect, what we got wrong is we thought that the arc of history bends towards justice, as Martin Luther King said, and we thought it was just all inevitable. And we stopped doing the hard work to make it happen. And most certainly with respect to Russia, I moved back to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992 to help start a pro-democracy NGO called the National Democratic Institute. And we were there to nurture democratic ideas and democratic practices. It was a really fun time to be a young social scientist, and that was your day job. Talk about federalism and proportional representation, and everybody wanted us there back then. By the way, I think people forget that we were the invited guests of the government. We were not some fomenters of revolution at that point, but we didn't do enough of that kind of work because we did kind of thought it was just inevitable. We didn't have to do this. And then we had this blip of a kind of isolationist moment in 1992, when a governor from Arkansas said, you know, all this engagement in the outside world, it's the economy, stupid. That was his slogan.
Bill Clinton, of course.
Bill Clinton. And that was a fateful year, because that was the year that, if had we leaned in my opinion, to really help these post-communist economies endure this economic recession, depression that they were living under, it might have been helped to consolidate democracy there, but we pulled back, and then, you know, it eroded, and the
rest is history. Yeah. The title of your book on all this is The End of American Hegemony. Our mutual friend Jim Goldgeier wrote a very good book about the mistakes that American foreign policy made in terms of this period. How much of the failure do you think of the West can be given maybe to Clinton, to the American administration, and perhaps their failure to recognize that they needed to be not less hegemonic, but more hegemonic if they were going to shape a future that they wanted?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I would say two broad strokes. And I do trace that history from the end of the Cold War to where we're at in all the chapters in the book. I actually think we should have leaned in more. And I know that's a provocative thing to say, but had we, you know, I think about World War II, where we did lean in to help countries.
And can we be a little less euphemistic, Mike? Lean in, meaning get our own way, tell people what to do.
And be more confident in our views that the democratic institutions and market institutions are the correct institutions, not to be afraid to do that. Even when I was in the government during the Arab Spring, I worked at the White House, and that was a euphoric moment for a while when these autocracies collapsed. But then we hesitated. We're like, well, we shouldn't dictate what the Egyptians do. I think that was a mistake. I think we should have, they didn't know how to build democratic institutions. We should have been more forceful in trying to say, you know, these are the experiences of other countries, and leaned into that. Number two, we also should have been more, what's the right way to put this? More play by the rules that we ourselves wanted others to adhere to. So in my mind, the war in Iraq was a violation of that. And that had long-term negative consequences for our leadership in the world. And I experienced that when I was the US ambassador. Whenever I would say something about democracy, they would say, well, what about Iraq? And that was also a mistake. But the third mistake is here more at home, and it's partly why I wrote this book, is elites in both the Democratic and Republican Party kind of said, we got this. We know how to do American foreign policy, and you Americans, especially middle America, you know, don't worry about it. We got this. And I think we stopped making the argument to the American people about why we needed to be engaged in the world, why trade is good, why tariffs are bad, why promoting democracy serves our national interests. And that created a vacuum for others to come along, Democrats and Republicans, but especially Donald Trump the first time around and the second time around to say there's a different way to do it. And now we're in this period of growing isolationism, which I think is very dangerous. So part of why I wrote this book is to try to make these arguments, not just to people in Cambridge and Palo Alto, but throughout the country.
Your background, Mike, is as a expert on Russia. You did your PhD at Stanford, Oxford. So you're all too familiar with the debate between, shall we say, the liberals when it came to Russia, people like George Breslauer, who I worked with, you worked with very closely, and shall we say the Russia hawks, the classic historians at Berkeley, people like Martin Mailia. Do you think that the Breslauers of the world, Gail Lapidus, of course, at Stanford, who you know all too well, do you think, I wouldn't say we should be blaming them, because I'm not sure it's an appropriate kind of conversation, but do they have that liberal wing, shall we say, of the Sovietological community? Do they have a responsibility for being a little over-optimistic about Russia or post-Soviet Russia?
That's a great question. I haven't thought about that for a while. You know, I would say a couple of things. First of all, if you go way back in that era, in the Soviet era, there was a kind of group, Jerry Huff, Stephen Cohen, I can't remember where George and Gail were on this, but I think they were close to that, which when Mikhail Gorbachev came along, that he was the great liberalizer of socialism, and they were fans of Gorbachev, and I was too, rightly so. I thought he was a great leader and really changed the course of history. But when the Soviet Union broke down and more radical groups took over, Boris Yeltsin in Russia being the most important one, they turned against them, right? And I was in a different camp. I don't think the Soviet Union can reform. I think it has to collapse. I wrote about that in the early 90s, and disagreed with some of those people. So I think that part analytically we got wrong. But the part about whether Russia could reform or not, I think it was the right bet, and I'm emphasizing that word on purpose, to have open the hypothesis that democratic institutions could take hold inside Russia. I most certainly believed it. I moved there to try to do that, right? And I have enough personal Russian friends who are just as liberal and democratic as I am. Most of them live abroad these days. Two of them have been murdered by Vladimir Putin, Boris Nemtsov, and Alexei Navalny. But I don't see them, because of the cultural history or something, a long-term hundreds of years of Tsarism, as being any different than me. And I would say ideologically, with my Russian liberal friends, I have way more in common with them than I do with, say, a guy like Steve Bannon, who does not share my worldview, even though our passports are the same color. But here's what we did get wrong. So we took a bet, but we should have had a hedge to that bet. And that's, I think, was the mistake. We should have been more aggressive in expanding NATO to those countries that were subjugated by the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire. We should have, if we couldn't get them into NATO, countries like Ukraine, we should have armed them to the teeth 20 years ago, not just a few years ago, to provide that deterrence for if things in Russia went bad. So that's what I would say as a second point. But the third point I want to say is a self-correction. I've had to kind of interrogate my hypothesis about the prospects of liberal ideas inside Russia because of this barbaric, horrific war that Putin launched. But he's not the only one fighting it. He's not the only one, he's not doing this all alone. The horrific atrocities inside Ukraine, rape, kidnapping, stealing things, he's not doing that alone. And I had this moment one day with a very prominent leader in Ukraine. His name's Andrei Yermak. He's the chief of staff for President Zelensky. And we were having this exact conversation, Andrew. And he put on a tape for me of something they picked up of a Russian soldier calling his girlfriend in Barcelona, who was shopping there. And he was bragging about all these horrific things he had just done inside Ukraine. And she applauded him. And Andrei then turned to me and said, Mike, these are Russians. This is not Putin. These are other Russians. What do you say to that? And I'm not willing to say all Russians are bad. I don't believe in these kind of deterministic theories. But I have to say, since this war, the full-scale invasion, I feel a lot less confident in the thinking about a future liberal democratic Russia than I once did.
I noted before we went live, I made a film about fixing democracy. One of the people we interviewed was Rick Stengel, who used to be the editor of Time magazine. I'm sure you know him very well. He tells a great story about Putin. You went to interview him in Time when he was Time
Man of the Year.
Man of the Year. What year was that?
2007.
2007. Remarkable historical anecdote. Anyway, he went to interview him, and Putin, of course, made no effort to talk to him, made it clear that he didn't speak English or didn't want to speak English with Stengel. And then at one point, Stengel said to him, what's your favorite Beatles song? Because they were trying to get Putin to talk, and he instantly said Yesterday. And of course, for Stengel and for the movie, it was a great metaphor for Putin's inability to look forward to his nostalgia. Yeah. You've spent a lot of time with Putin. You were the US ambassador there. You've spent much of your life studying him and his group of ex-KGB people. Is Putin's ideology all about yesterday? And why can't he look forward, Mike?
Again, super great question. I don't have a super easy answer to. I have followed Putin for a long time. I actually met him for the first time in 1991. So we have a long history.
Not in Dresden. Was it in Dresden or in Russia?
St. Petersburg. He was the deputy mayor to a very liberal, charismatic mayor at the time, Anatoly Sobchak, and he was the deputy in charge of international relations. And I was there with an American delegation. So we met him. And I also met back then for Russia Hands, his deputy, who I organized the conference with, choosing whether we're going to have chicken or fish. His name was Igor Sechin. He's now the CEO of Rosneft. So I go way back with those characters. And I've written about them. I think the word Putin appears in over 60 articles and books of mine. And I did for 5 years interact with them.
And you've written a lot of books.
There they are. Yes,
they all are. I think 9 of them, maybe more.
9 of them, and I've edited a few more on the Orange Revolution. That's not in that picture, but I edited other books. But so I would say a couple of things about Putin. First, he was an accidental president. He was not a charismatic leader fomenting the counter-revolution to democracy in Yeltsin. He played an inside game. He was a systemic person, worked for Sobchak, then got a job in the Kremlin with Yeltsin. It was only later that he wanted to rewrite history to say he was all against that. He wasn't. And it was only because there was this 1998 financial crash that the heir apparent to Yeltsin, his name was Boris Nemtsov, they had to, because they had a democracy, the government had to fall because of that disaster, and they brought in the communists, and they're like, oh my God, we can't have the communists take over, and they inserted Putin, and then they started the Chechen War, and that's how he became a popular prime minister and then president. And in those early days, I would say a couple of things. I don't think he was really anti-Western. He said, we should join NATO back in 2000. He wasn't anti-markets. He cut income tax, personal income tax to 13%, flat tax. My colleagues at the Hoover Institution have been dreaming about flat tax for decades here. That idea came from the Hoover Institution. Hasn't happened in America. It did happen there. He was never a Democrat. He always was against democratic institutions and went after them right away. But I think what happened over time, a couple of things. One, September 11th happened, and that brought us together. And I sat across the table from him and listened to him talk about that when I was there with President Obama in 2009, where we had a common enemy, terrorism. And then we didn't bring him into the club. We didn't coordinate with them. And even on Iraq, he said to us one time, he said, had you worked with us, we might have been able to handle this situation in Iraq rather than you go it alone. So that was the first chip on his shoulder where he felt like we were treating him as the junior partner. But the biggest event that flipped him was democratic expansion. It starts in Serbia in 2000, Georgia 2003, and then the really big one, Orange Revolution, Ukraine 2004. And that event, I think more than any other event, turned him against the United States, made him think that Bush was really not in charge of what he has a real deep state theory of America. And he just saw the hands of the CIA behind that. He went on and on about it when we met with them in 2009. And on about the Iraq War and us doing all this regime change stuff, right? And in response, President Obama said to him, well, that may be the Bush administration, but I want you to know I was against the war in Iraq. We're not going to do that kind of stuff. And to remind everybody, Senator Obama, even before he was a senator in the U.S. Senate in Illinois, he spoke out against the war in 2002. That was something he was very passionate about, and it's part of the reason he won the Democratic primary in 2008. So that was an interesting exchange, right? Putin had never heard an American talk like that. But then just a year and a half later, the Arab Spring happened throughout the Middle East, massive demonstrations against autocrats, and Putin blamed us for that.
Including Egypt, which you mentioned earlier.
Yes, including Egypt. And we tried to explain to him we weren't doing that, but he didn't believe us. And then the same year, I think that's really important for people to remember, the same year it happened inside Russia. There was a parliamentary election, still unlike normal elections. We didn't think anything of it. I got to tell you honestly, 5-6%. What's the big deal? This is Russia. But this time around, there was a middle class that had formed. They had owned property. They said no taxation without representation. And 400, 4,000, 40,000, and eventually, 250,000 people were on the streets of Moscow again, just like they were in 1991. And Putin blamed us for that. He blamed us. And by the way, he blamed me personally.
Which is a compliment. I wish he'd blame me personally for something.
Well, they did, right as I showed up to be the U.S. ambassador, they did these hit jobs on their national media saying that I was sent by Barack Obama to foment revolution against him. And then 2 years later, there was another one of these events, the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. That's what the Ukrainians call it. He calls it a CIA covert operation to undermine one of his allies. So those events, I think, were, these democratic movements. They were all peaceful, by the way, in his region, and they began peaceful in the Arab world. But for him, that was us, threatening him. And that's how I think we turned again. Are
there a tiny seed of, shall we say, Mearsheimerism in your narrative, Mike? John Mearsheimer is a very prominent American political scientist, international relations expert. You've debated him in public many times, who suggests that perhaps America could have done more to bring the Russians into the system, be more sympathetic to their historic sensitivities, perhaps paranoia about being surrounded. Are you acknowledging in an odd kind of way? I mean, maybe Obama should have done more. I mean, he had an opportunity to reset the relationship. He clearly didn't succeed. What's your take on the Mearsheimer narrative? Is he entirely wrong?
Not entirely wrong, but mostly wrong. And let me explain. He's right. His most famous book about the tragedy of great powers. I teach it every year in my class about this book. And my book, by the way, I think of as a compliment to John's book. He's a classic realist. I'm more of a liberal. And I think for students to wrestle with both of these books, I do it every year. And by the way, just so you know,
you're Ernie Haas and he's Ken Waltz.
I hadn't thought of that, but yes, there's some parallels to that era, your era at Berkeley. And by the way, I present all this and I make my students debate. And I don't always win in the end. I poll people at the end. I think Mersheimer tends to win a lot of the debates in my own class, by the way. But here's where I think he's wrong. So first of all, does power matter in the international system? Of course. Like that's duh. Of course. You know, you're not interested in talking to me about U.S.-Kyrgyz relations because nobody cares about Kyrgyzstan because they don't have enough power to threaten us. That's not an interesting question, right? So it all starts with power. And on that sense, John is right. He's also right, but he likes to forget this part of his book. When he writes about offensive realism, about how powers expand and they'll only keep expanding unless you stop them, you can't appease them. I think it's page 107 of his book, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere along that line. And that is a really good lesson for how to deal with Putin's Russia today, that he himself no longer makes that argument. His book came out in 2012. But here's what he gets wrong, in my view. He leaves out regime type. He thinks it doesn't matter whether they're Democrats or autocrats. And I see history differently. In the 1990s, we had a much more cooperative relationship with Russia because Russia was a democratic country and Putin wanted to join the West. Today, Russia is more autocratic. And as a result, we have more tensions over these things I was just talking about. And those ideas and the regime type needs to be added to the equation about power. It's democratic expansion that threatened Putin, not NATO expansion. And I think that's where John and I would disagree. And the reason I feel strongly about it is because I was in the government for 5 years. And there was this big summit before we got there in Bucharest in 2008, where they had this kind of uncertain outcome about expansion of NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. 3 months later, Putin invaded Georgia. And as a result of that, that was the end of any debate about NATO expansion to Georgia. And then a year after that, a year and a half after that, Yanukovych wins the election in Ukraine. And that was the end of the debate about expansion of NATO to that country. And so it was over. It was not a serious issue at all. I mean, I was there for 5 years and I was on every phone call and every meeting with Putin and Medvedev. NATO expansion was simply not a major issue of contention. In fact, Medvedev came to the NATO summit in 2010. And go look it up for your listeners. See what he was saying about NATO then. He was talking about all kinds of cooperative things. So that happened after these waves of expansion that John says is the reason for confrontation. And just as a good social scientist, you had variation. We had cooperation and then confrontation after NATO expansion. So that single factor can explain cooperation and confrontation. You got to add something else to the equation.
Sensitivity about democracy, or democratic expansion. Your book is not just about Russia and America. It's also about China. You're a Russia expert, but China is, with America, is the three powers in today's new, what you call global disorder. How does Xi fit into this? Are there very direct comparisons between Xi and Putin? We've done a number of shows on Xi as well. He seems a much tougher character, certainly than Trump and even than Putin. His background is of enormous persecution. His life is actually quite a remarkable life.
Yes.
What do you make of Xi? Is his narrative also driven by sensitivity of democratic expansionism? In your chapter on him, you talk about exporting Xi Jinping's thought as opposed to exporting Putinism. I'm not sure what the difference is between Putinism and Xi Jinping's thought. But tell us what you, Mike McFaul, think of Xi Jinping and his thinking.
So first, when I try to explain cooperation and confrontation in 250 years, I have three factors, right? Not just one. And that's not very popular in social science, as you might remember. But I have tenure, so now I can write the way I want, and I'm not constrained by political science methodology. It's power, regime types, and leaders. It's all three. And I think power matters the most, regime types second, and leaders third. But I do think Xi Jinping, even if the power was the same and the regime type was the same, he as an individual has pushed China in a more aggressive way in terms of foreign policy, and inside China, more state intervention into the economy. And a different leader, my hypothesis, my counterfactual would be a different leader might have pushed them in a different way. And I think the same thing about Vladimir Putin. So that's one where they're parallel. Where they're different, there's several differences, but two I think are most important. So one, in terms of what they're seeking to export, Putinism is illiberal nationalism. He sees the liberal decadent West. He doesn't think Russia should be a part of it. And after he consolidated power and his regime at home, he started to propagate these ideas through Russia Today, Sputnik, Russian NGOs meeting with European and American NGOs with this like-mindedness. The Russian Orthodox Church was a big actor, continues to be, meeting with evangelical churches in America. I remember when I was ambassador and getting this cable of this meeting between these Baptist ministers who were visiting the Russian Orthodox Church to talk about, the decadence of the liberal West. That's Putin's game. And that's different, by the way, than the Cold War, because that's a war, that's an ideological struggle within countries, not just between them. And there are millions of Europeans and Americans that ideologically are closer to Putin than they are to me. Xi Jinping he's not playing in that game. You don't see Xi Jinping, he's not fomenting revolution. He's not trying to find ideological allies in Europe and America. He's more focused on the developing world and this kind of state-led development model, and it is popular. And I have the data in the book. There are countries where they think this is our way, just like the Chinese did. That's where he's focused. And it's a very different kind of autocracy, autocratic set of ideas than Putin. But the other way he's different, obviously China has a great deal more power than Putin's Russia. And I go through all the metrics in the book. But he's playing, I would say, a more evolutionary, not revolutionary or as revisionist game as Putin is. Putin doesn't have the same resources, but as we've learned tragically in Ukraine, what resources he has, he's willing to use in very provocative imperial ways. Xi Jinping's not doing that, at least not yet. I think he has a slower game, and I think it could be a more dangerous game because we're not watching it as closely. But he's not seeking to destroy the liberal international order. He's not seeking to blow up the United Nations or NATO or even the World Trade Organization, even if he cheats on it. He wants to increase Chinese power within those groups. And then he's creating his own groups, BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, trading organizations, regional groups, where instead of us being the anchor, the United States, China is the anchor. And these large are not all, but most of those countries are autocratic. And that's much slower, but I think in the long run might be a greater threat than the more erratic imperial Putin that we see in Europe today.
I mean, it seems to be straight out of the Waltzian realpolitik handbook of the structural inevitability of power to be distributed, certainly with rising China. I wonder, we haven't talked much about America or Trump. There's a lot of talk these days about Trump embracing state capitalism. Trump's interested in investing in tech companies like Intel. Do you see, if there is a convergence in terms of your three actors, Mike, in this book, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder, do you see more convergence between China and America? Are they coming together much more closely and in some ways perhaps chillingly than Russia, which, as you say, is a troublemaker, but not a particularly powerful one?
Well, that's an interesting, I do think there's a lot, especially on the economic side, as we figure out how to compete more effectively with China. There are many who believe we got to be more like them. And what you just showed, in my world, those are called state-owned enterprises. I associate that with communism. I'm not a big fan of that, by the way. I think that's, in the long term, not a good strategy. But also tariffs, protecting our industries. That's the Chinese do that in different ways, getting the state more involved in promoting state capitalism. That's one of the slides you just showed. There is more of a convergence there. I don't think it's the right strategy for America, but analytically, I see that happening.
I mean, that's what Trumpism is, isn't it? A shift from neoliberalism to a more state-centric capitalism, and of course, an ambivalence, if that's the right word, towards democracy.
Well, and let me break that down, both the state capitalism versus the democratic institutions part. On the latter, yes, he wants the state to be involved and call the shots, and tariffs to help special enterprises in America, and that's more like the Chinese model. And I think in the long term, that's a loser strategy for America. I don't think we're going to beat the Chinese at their own game. I think more freedom, individual innovation, capital markets. I don't want the state to pick winners and losers. I think we'll fail at that. But I could be wrong. That part, that we got to wait to see. That's a longer term trajectory. We got to see how that plays out. On the political side, there's no doubt about it that Trump has autocratic proclivities. He doesn't care about democracy as much as I do, that's for sure. And, the first term he came in and he kind of tiptoed towards this. I actually wrote a piece comparing Putin and Trump in the Washington Post in February of 2017, so a month after he became president. It really didn't happen in that first term, but this second time around, he feels more emboldened. He feels like he has a mandate, and he does have a mandate. He doesn't have all those checks on him, the generals around him to take off the edges. He has more maneuverability within his own government. And three, he moved fast, right? And revolutionaries, I used to teach courses on revolutions here at Stanford. You move fast, you break things, so that
it's the Mark Zuckerberg's old line about
and it's also Lenin's line.
And Steve Bannon, who always seems to me to be somewhat of a Leninist in his own.
He is definitely a Leninist, yes. And when you, the imagery is on my mind right now, because when you literally bulldoze things like the president is doing to the White House, where I used to work, it's the costs of rebuilding it to go back to status quo ante are much higher. And so this bulldozing of, USAID and all that foreign policy stuff, they did that very quickly, and that'll be very hard to reconstruct. And I don't think it'll ever happen. He's trying to do the same on the democratic institution sides within the country. But there I'm a little more optimistic. He's trying, using the law to go after his enemies. That's a very autocratic thing to do. That's what Putin did against my friends in Russia. We'll see if he succeeds. I'm impressed so far by his lack of success on that. He's trying to get rid of independent media he doesn't like through reorganization of property rights. That's what Putin did in the early 2000s. And then later, there was this very famous show, Kukli Puppets, where he pulled it off. And he shut down the one independent television station. Well, Trump's trying to do that. He tried to get rid of Kimmel, but then there was pushback. And I would say just the blessing we have is that, one, we have a longer tradition of democratic governance in America, going back a couple hundred years. The Russians didn't have that in the 1990s. They just had a few years of it. And that allowed Putin to play into these other more nationalistic and strong state. He wouldn't use the word autocratic, but strong state, these Russian traditions. We have an anti-state tradition. Was called No Kings on Purpose, right? And two, we still have a lot of institutions with autonomy from the presidential administration. We have governors. We have more independent media than the Russians have. We even have a Democratic Party that's a bit fleckless these days, but it's not subservient to to the White House and the way that all the opposition.
Yeah, and the epilogue of your book is "Don't bet against America just yet." So you remain an optimist. You're not in the wither America camp yet. Couple more questions, Mike. I know you got to run. A couple of old friends of mine, I'm sure you know them, Steve Hansen and Jeff Kopstein from Berkeley, wrote an interesting piece recently on the patrimonialism of autocrats like Trump and Putin.
Yes.
Is this patrimonialism, and it extends to Xi, I think, as well, is this a return to the 19th century, to the three emperors, to a traditionally almost Waltzian way of carving up the world? Is that what's happening historically? Is there something new? Is it a traditional patrimonialism, or is it a kind of postmodern one?
Well, that's a big, hard question. And I forgot about you. You went to school with a lot of these great people.
Yeah, I mean, we should do a show with all of them. Kopstein, Hansen, Goldgeier. And we need to get Tom Firestone, I know, who you know also very well, who has another interesting history.
Yes, and Tom and I worked together in Moscow till he got.
I know all about that. And when he got arrested at the airport, we'll have to do a show on that.
He's been fighting the good fight for a long time. I'm a huge fan of Tom's. And I remember the phone call when he was trapped at the airport and saying that it looks like I'm flying back to London.
He's often told me about that phone call between you and him.
But to your very hard question that I don't have an easy answer to, there's no doubt that all three of those leaders, in slightly different ways, but patrimonialism is part of the playbook. Putin thinks of himself as the czar taking care of all the peasants that don't know how to take care of themselves. I've heard him talk in those terms, right? We can't practice democracy because we're not modern enough. Most certainly the way President Trump talks about his supporters reminds me of that. I'm going to take care of the kids, because they need a fighter like me, even though I don't think he's doing much for them. What I don't know is the second part. Is it new or is it backwards? I think for Putin, the leader of those three that I know the best, most certainly he loves the 19th century. He'd love to go back to that world.
I mean, he fancies himself as a czar, dealing with Metternich and
he likes that,
and the Ottoman Empire and all the rest.
Yes, and Trump these days, not Trump 1, but Trump 2, they talk in similar terms. They talk about hemispheric control and spheres of influence. They don't seem afraid of those kind of terms. Xi Jinping, I think, has initially regional aspirations and then global. But all of them feel pretty retro to me. And I think that is not a world I want to go back to.
Final question, Mike. Your book, as I said, is the subtitle is China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder. We began by talking about the almost unnatural global order after the Second World War. If we're to get to a 21st century global order, which isn't just a return to the post-Second World War age, what's it going to look like? I mean, certainly, Russia may not be the kind of wannabe power that it is, but it's certainly going to be a world dominated by China and America. We're not going to have an American hegemony again.
Yeah.
What will it look like? How will it be different from the post-Second World War age?
Well, there's the analytic part and the prescriptive part. So on the analytic part, I'm not sure. On the prescriptive part, I think I know what I think would be good for American national interests, which is to go back, and I do this in the book, to learn about some of the things we did right after 45, and in particular to bring the free world more closely together. It won't be as powerful, to your very important point. We will never have the same hegemonic power that we had after World War II or in 1991. And dreaming about that, I think, leads to overreach, and we can't try to do that. And with Trump himself, I don't see a lot of that. But when Trump won, he had some people around him that wanted that hegemonic power. I think that's a recipe for disaster. I talk about the dangers of overreach. I don't think that's a prudent strategy. But bringing together the free world so that collectively, we have more economic power than China and their autocratic friends. We have more military power collectively. I think we have better ideas than they do, but we can only realize that power if it's collective. It cannot be unilateral, because the United States alone will not achieve it. And if we try to achieve it in a unilateral way, we're actually going to compel some of those democracies to gravitate towards China. You look at India today, look at South Africa today. Why are we alienating those countries? That to me is very problematic. So if we did get our act together, I think it would be a kind of détente, peaceful coexistence relationship with China. And by the way, it doesn't require us to completely decouple from China and the economy. I don't think there's any reason to do that. I don't think there's any reason to try to contain Chinese economic activity all over the world. I don't think there's any reason to do that. That would be in the overreach category. But I do think we need to be together, because if we're not, then I worry that China will dominate the 21st century. And that means that dictators will be dominating the 21st century. And that I don't think is good for America's national interests.
Or for Americans in general. That is the interesting conclusion from Michael McFaul. His new book, Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, America, and the New Global Disorder, is out. Congratulations, Mike, on the book. And we'll have to get back together with you to figure out whether or not America is part of the autocratic or the democratic camp. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great, terrific conversation, Andrew. Bye-bye.